Welcome back to the third and final part of our in-depth tour of Venice, one of the world's most beautiful cities. We pick up our walk where we left off, on the southern edge of the historic city centre, looking towards the atmospheric island of Giudecca across the wide-open Giudecca Canal. This sprawling stretch of water is one of the three major canals in Venice, the others being the Cannaregio Canal and of course the Grand Canal. And it's lined by a spacious promenade known as the Zattere, a delightful open space with some stunning views that's a popular spot among Venetians to relax, take a leisurely stroll, or sit down for a calming meal. We'll begin our walk by taking a stroll along the Zattere here, before we then make our way back into Venice's busy maze of streets, as we explore the southeastern corner of the city, and pass by an array of famous landmarks from the prestigious Gallerie dell'Accademia to the elegant Basilica di Santa Maria della Salute. We'll also walk past the popular Peggy Guggenheim art collection and take in some breathtaking views across the end of the Grand Canal from the fetching Academy Bridge, the only wooden bridge spanning Venice's main waterway. All of that is to come over the next 35 minutes or so, which will bring an end to our more than 2.5-hour walk. And if you've missed the first two parts of our tour, I do recommend you go back and watch them to get an introduction to this city's illustrious history and most famous sights. But without further ado, let's get going on the last leg of our walk, which begins on Venice's beautiful Zattere, looking towards the island of Giudecca. Today, the shoreline of Giudecca Island is absolutely dominated by the large brick building that we can see across the water, an immense former flour mill built in the late 19th century that's known as the Molino Stucchi. Certainly distinctive in the scope of Venice's many striking landmarks, the Molino Stucchi today plays home to a 5-star hotel. But it provides an interesting insight into the many differences between Giudecca Island and the historic centre of Venice here. Historically, Giudecca was home to a sparse collection of palaces and spacious fields that served as a retreat for Venice's wealthiest families away from the cramped streets of the city centre. One of those being the family of the explorer Marco Polo, whose former house you can visit on the island to this day. The greater open space on Giudecca also led it to becoming a hub of heavy industry in the 19th and early 20th centuries, with grand factories like the Molino Stucchi flour mill built. But today the island has regained its reputation as a calm retreat from the busy heart of the city. It's often a popular holiday spot among local Venetians seeking to escape the throngs of tourists on the city's narrowest and most famous streets. However, there are always places that locals are able to get a break from the crowds, and one such place is here, on the Zattere, a nearly 2-kilometre long promenade that follows the route of the Giudecca Canal, and is lined with an array of historic houses, churches, cafes, restaurants, and more. It's here on this wide open pavement then, a fair walk away from the busiest part of the city centre, that many Venetians are able to relax and enjoy the views over the water, as a plethora of boats, big and small, make their way through the city. Now, while we know that the island across the canal has long been a popular retreat for those living in the heart of the city, it also has its own intriguing history that's independent of central Venice, a history which can be uncovered through its name. Originally, in Venice's early days, Giudecca was home to a small community of fishermen, and was known by an entirely different name, Spinalonga, said to derive from the island's long and thin profile. Over time though, the island came to be known as Giudecca, or Giudecca in Old Venetian dialect, and there are a number of theories as to where this name came from, the most commonly held suggesting that the island was home to the very first Jewish community in Venice. Giudecca, therefore, could translate literally as something like the Jewry, and it's said that the island was once home to 2 synagogues, which were eventually destroyed in the 18th century. Of course, if you know Venice's districts, it's not Giudecca that's most associated with the city's Jewish population, but the sestieri of Cannaregio, on the northern side of the historic centre. Once upon a time, Cannaregio was home to a sprawling Jewish ghetto that was legally separated from the rest of Venice for more than 200 years, from 1516 to 1797, when the Republic of Venice eventually fell. As a side note, the word ghetto, used in modern English and many more languages, is widely agreed to have originated here in Venice, deriving from a local word referring to the segregated area of the city. And it's not the only widely known word to have come from this famous city. Venice is also thought to have been the birthplace for terms like marionette, arsenal, lagoon, gazette, quarantine, and even the Italian greeting, ciao. We'll talk more about the many words Venice has given to the world later on, but here we're passing by the fetching Church of Santa Maria della Visitazione, built in the late 15th century, and which is the oldest example of a Renaissance-era church in all of Venice. With more than 500 years of history under its belt, the Visitation Church has long been a fixture of the city's waterfront here, overlooking the Giudecca Canal, having originally served as a church for an order of monks who came to this city all the way from Tuscany. Later on in history, the church passed into the hands of a larger fraternity of Dominican friars who eventually outgrew it. And so, needing a larger venue to carry out worship, they decided to build a grand new church just a few steps away from their old home. But it wasn't just size the monks were aiming for. They sought to build as exquisite a church as possible, intending to celebrate their order and to be highly visible to all of the passing traffic on the waters of the Giudecca Canal. That new church was this, the Church of Santa Maria del Rosario, which is more commonly known simply as I Gesuati, and it was built over the course of 30 years in the first half of the 18th century, employing the talents of some of the finest Venetian architects and artists of the age. To this day, the Gesuati church remains one of the most striking structures on the nearly 2-kilometre length of the Zattere here. Now, we won't have time to walk along the entire length of the Zattere, but they too are home to an interesting history. Officially, this long promenade is known as the Fondamenta delle Zattere, literally meaning the pavement of the rafts, as this was once upon a time the place where rafts would land in Venice delivering wood, used for the building of ships, boats and gondolas for the city. Once upon a time a rudimentary shoreline busy with rafts, the Zattere were eventually converted into a grand, paved canal-side promenade in the year 1516. And ever since, they've been one of the most delightful places in the whole city, certainly quieter and more peaceful than the sprawling Riva degli Schiavoni near St. Mark's Square, or the banks of the Grand Canal. Sadly though, it's time for us to make our way off the Zattere, and venture back into the streets of Venice and its southernmost sestiere of Dorsoduro. Immediately, we're taken from the wide-open views beside the Giudecca Canal into a narrow, dark alleyway that passes underneath the houses of the Zattere. But this provides us with a handy shortcut towards some of the most spectacular buildings of Dorsoduro, as we now make our way across the district in the direction of the Grand Canal. Emerging back out into the light, we suddenly find ourselves on the spacious Campo di Sant'Agnese, yet another of the many fetching local squares in Dorsoduro, which takes its name from the rather large Church of Sant'Agnese just in front of us. The church is home to more than 900 years of history, originally founded in the late 11th or possibly even 10th century AD, although that original medieval church building burned down in a fire in the year 1105. Reconstructed on a larger scale, the modern Church of Sant'Agnese is today one of the biggest places of worship in this part of the city, which was once upon a time home to a large number of monasteries belonging to numerous different religious orders. We already spoke about the Gesuati church on the Zattere, and just across this square from the Church of Sant'Agnese, we find the building that once upon a time played home to the Gesuati, where monks resided and dedicated their lives to worship and healing the sick and infirm of Venice. As we see it today, this former monastery dates at its oldest from the late 15th century, around the time when the Visitation Church that we passed by earlier was built. But nowadays, the building plays host to a cultural centre and, rather unusually, a bed and breakfast hotel, with about 80 rooms that allow guests to stay in an extremely picturesque and historic venue. Though not located in the centre of San Marco, Venice's most touristy district, the former monastery is actually situated in an ideal location for visitors in the city, with the beautiful Zattere on its doorstep and the Grand Canal less than a minute's walk away too. In fact, this street that we're walking along now, home to the former monastery and the prestigious Cavanis Institute, here on the right, was historically a busy route that allowed people to pass between the Giudecca Canal and the Grand Canal, although not by foot. For a long time, this street was a canal running between islands, known as the Rio de Sant'Agnese, after the church. But it was filled in with earth in the mid-19th century, creating a handy route between the two widest waterways in Venice, which takes just a couple of minutes to walk. Of course, the conversion of the former canal into a street is nothing unusual in Venice. The very first example of this is thought to have taken place over 600 years ago in the late 14th century. And over the centuries, tens of canals all across the city were filled in with earth to improve mobility for those living here. Of course, walking was generally a simpler way of getting about than having to get in a boat everywhere you needed to go. As a result, the number of canals in Venice has actually gradually declined over time. Today there are around 150 waterways in the city. But you can always tell which streets were once canals, as you'll see their street signs bear the words Rio Terà, meaning a stream filled in with earth. This street, for example, is the Rio Terà Foscarini, named after Antonio Foscarini, a 17th century nobleman who was falsely imprisoned for sharing the Republic's state secrets with other nations, and whose innocence was only discovered after he was killed while in prison. There's always a fascinating story behind every street name in Venice, but as we mentioned, the Rio Terà Foscarini has led us right from the Giudecca Canal to the Grand Canal, Venice's immense central waterway that's crossed by only 4 bridges, one of those being the huge wooden bridge that stands in front of us here. This is the Ponte dell'Accademia, or the Academy Bridge, and although it's certainly nowhere near as famous as the spectacular Rialto Bridge further up the Grand Canal, it's arguably one of the most underrated landmarks in all of Venice. Built in 1933, the bridge is deceptively modern, but its quaint wooden structure harks back to Venice's origins, when all of the city's bridges were made of wood. And it also offers some of the most impressive views of the Grand Canal, near to where the canal empties out into the San Marco Basin, beside the Doge's Palace and St. Mark's Square, where we started our walk more than 2 hours ago. We'll venture up onto the Academy Bridge now to take in some of those views. But this is also one of the many places in Venice where you can begin a trip on a traditional gondola through the city's canals. Certainly one of the most popular things to do when in Venice, albeit also one of the most expensive. A gondola trip will usually set you back between 80 and 100 euros, and while it's certainly worth doing if you've got the money, venturing up onto the bridges of the Grand Canal is another great way to experience the city's views away from its narrow streets and alleyways. Now, as we mentioned, the Academy Bridge here offers probably the best views of any of the bridges on the Grand Canal. Here we're looking along the canal in the direction of the Rialto Bridge, lined by an array of grand palaces as it bends around the historic sestieri of San Marco. But of course, while this is one of the best places in Venice to get a picture of its most famous canal, the Academy Bridge wasn't built just for tourists. In fact, before the current bridge, the original Academy Bridge was built here over the Grand Canal in 1854 by the authorities of the Austrian Empire, who, as we mentioned in the first part of our walk, occupied Venice for much of the period following the fall of the Republic. That Austrian-built bridge was actually made of iron, and it gave Venetians the very first chance to gaze out towards the mouth of the Grand Canal from up on high, with this beautiful view dominated by the dome of the Basilica di Santa Maria della Salute in the distance. We'll be visiting that basilica at the end of our walk in just over 20 minutes' time, but the old iron bridge of 1854 that once stood here, of course, no longer does. In the 1930s, a competition was held to find a replacement design for the old bridge, but none of the submissions were preferred by the city, leading them to build a temporary wooden bridge that ended up becoming a beloved landmark in itself. The wooden Academy Bridge that exists today was actually rebuilt in 1986, albeit to the exact same plans as the original 1933 design. And it takes its name from one prestigious landmark that existed here on the Grand Canal's southern bank for nearly 200 years, the Accademia di Belle Arti di Venezia. That translates as the Venice Academy of Fine Arts, originally founded in 1750, but which moved to this point in Venice in 1807, taking over the buildings of the Scuola Grande della Carità, one of the city's historic scuole grandi that we discussed in the previous part of our walk. After nearly 2 centuries, the Academy of Fine Arts moved away from this site in 2004, but what remains here is the famed Gallerie dell'Accademia, the Academy Galleries, which began life as the gallery displaying the Academy's own art collection, but which grew into an independent art museum that today displays some of the finest pieces of Venetian art in history. The most famous artwork inside the galleries, though, is by the Florentine artist Leonardo da Vinci, that being his iconic Vitruvian Man sketch, drawn around the year 1490. Although you'll have to be very lucky to catch a glimpse of the drawing on a visit to the Academy Galleries, as it's only displayed to the public on a few rare occasions, given its age and sensitivity to light and the elements. Now, the presence of the Academy of Fine Arts here on the southern bank of the Grand Canal was a major factor in the building of the original Academy Bridge, as the prestigious art institution brought more attention and activity to this part of Dorsoduro, which, as we mentioned, was historically dotted with a large number of monasteries. The large building on our right, for example, was once the Church of Santa Maria della Carità, built in the 15th century as part of a neighbouring convent. And while this was once upon a time one of the most important landmarks in the local area, it gradually declined in significance, particularly once it was taken over by the Academy in the 19th century. It was during the 19th century, then, that sprawling development took place in this part of the city, ranging from the building of the Academy Bridge to the creation of new streets like the Rio Terà Foscarini, which we just discussed. And today, with easy access to the heart of the city by way of the wooden bridge, this is one of the most popular areas of Dorsoduro, home to an array of fetching landmarks and a vast collection of hotels, big and small. On streets like the Calle Sant'Agnese here, you'll also find a larger number of shops, cafes and galleries directed at tourists in this part of the city, compared with the more residentially heavy areas of Dorsoduro that we were exploring in the second part of our walk. But even so, this area of Venice is always much quieter than San Marco, just across the Grand Canal, and also home to a few more spacious streets and canal-side pavements that let you get a breather from the busiest zones of the city. Plus, there's a wealth of things to see and do in this area, ranging from the Basilica and Peggy Guggenheim art collection that we'll be passing by a little later on, to a collection of smaller independent galleries displaying everything from traditional art to famed Murano glass, and a number of historic palaces that are open to visitors, including the Palazzo Cini just here on our left, which was originally built back in the 14th century, and which looks out onto the Grand Canal on its other side. This side of the palace, meanwhile, overlooks the Ponte de San Vio, another eye-catching bridge that spans the Rio de San Vio, which links the Grand Canal and the Giudecca Canal just on the other side of Dorsoduro. Both the bridge and the canal take their name from the old Church of San Vito, a historic parish church that stood nearby for nearly 1,000 years, from the 10th century to the 19th century. Now demolished, the old church has since been replaced by a newer chapel that stands on the other side of the canal from us, next to yet another palace, the Palazzo Barbaro. So there's plenty of history surrounding us here on the Rio de San Vio, but this calm waterway is also a nice place to take a moment to pause before we continue heading through the city's narrow streets. And while we're here, let's return to the story of some of the words that the city of Venice has given to the world, a number of which we mentioned while walking along the Zattere earlier on. Tens of words that we use commonly in English are generally believed to derive from the Veneto dialect of Italian spoken here in Venice, ranging from words you'd expect, like gondola, which is thought to relate to the Italian word dondolare, meaning to rock, just like the boat's movement, and of course lagoon, which derives from a word meaning a pond or hole, and was originally used to refer to the swampy waters of the Venetian lagoon here, separated from the rest of the Mediterranean Sea by pieces of land. But there are plenty of other words that you might not immediately expect to have come from Venice here. One such word is marionette, the large wooden puppets used in plays around the world. It's often said that marionette comes from wooden statues known as Maria di Legno, wooden Marys, used by Venetians as an offering to the Virgin Mary after it's said she saved 12 young Venetian girls from pirates in a miracle in the mid-10th century. Originally, 12 real girls paraded through the city in celebration of this miracle. But over time, Venetians began using large wooden statues instead, and they were known as Marioni, or Big Marys. And then they would sometimes make smaller versions of these, known as Marionette, or Little Big Marys. Venice was also the birthplace of the word quarantine, which derives from the historic practice of boats that arrived in the city and were suspected of carrying contagions being subjected to 40 days, or una quarantena, of isolation. However, while we could also talk about the fascinating origins behind English words like arsenal, gazette, ballot, and even pants, all thought to come from Venice, the city is also commonly thought to have been the place where one of the most famous words in the Italian language was born too. When in Italy, you'll probably know how to say hello and goodbye to the people you meet, with the handy greeting, ciao. Now, ciao is a quintessential Italian word in the modern day that's commonly believed to derive from the city of Venice, where it was historically used not as a casual hello and goodbye, but rather as a courteous greeting used by members of the government and upper classes. In the upper echelons of the court of the Republic of Venice, politicians would often greet those with a higher status with the greeting schiavo vostro, the Venetian phrase for the Italian schiavo vostro, that literally translates as your slave. Of course, the greeting's actual meaning was something more akin to I am your humble servant, and over time the phrase was gradually shortened as it became more widely used, developing into the modern Italian word that we know now, ciao. Now here we're approaching the point where the Rio de San Vio joins up with the Grand Canal, the city's iconic main waterway that's lined by more than 170 buildings dating from between the 13th and 20th centuries. Every now and then, particularly around canal junctions, you can stand between the buildings of the Grand Canal and gaze out across the water from dry land, with this point of the waterway home to a variety of delightful sights, including the wooden Academy Bridge, which we can see just in the distance. On the other side of the canal, meanwhile, there stand two large historic palaces, the Palazzo Cavalli Franchetti in yellow, and the Palazzi Barbaro beside it on the right. Now, both of these palaces have histories that date back over 500 years to the 15th century, but the latter of the two, the Palazzi Barbaro, has a particularly interesting heritage that relates to a more recent period in time, when it became a social hub not for local Venetians, but for wealthy Americans in the 19th century. You might be aware that there's a special adoration for Venice across the pond. The United States is actually home to 11 separate places named Venice, most after this Italian city. And one of them, the beachside neighborhood of Venice in Los Angeles, is even home to its own network of famous canals that takes after the heritage of the floating city here. Now, the Americans, of course, aren't the only people to have brought a Venetian-style city of canals to their own country. You'll find imitation versions of this city everywhere from China to the United Arab Emirates. But for more than 200 years, Venice, and particularly this part of the city, has been a point of real fascination for those from the United States. Initially, after independence in 1776, the United States joined an exclusive club of only 3 nations in the world that were ruled as republics, the others being the city-state of Geneva in modern-day Switzerland, and of course, the Republic of Venice. Unfortunately, the Republic of Venice fell just 21 years after the United States was born, but this fleeting bond between republics was the spark for centuries of links between the two cultures. Initially, given the great distance between the two places, American visits to Venice were relatively few and far between. But in the mid-1860s, the American consul working here in Venice, a man named William Dean Howells, penned a book named Venetian Life, which provided an in-depth exploration of day-to-day life in this curious city of canals. And it was Venetian life which appears to have lit the spark of US tourism to Venice, because after the end of the American Civil War in 1865, an influx of wealthy cultural figures began flocking to this city, buying up historic palaces on the Grand Canal and establishing their own expat communities in some of Venice's most luxurious spots. Almost directly across the Grand Canal from where we are now, you'll find a famous bar named Harry's, opened in 1931 by a local bartender named Giuseppe Cipriani. And it was called Harry's in honour of an American patron of the neighbouring Hotel Europa, with whom Cipriani shared a bond. Harry's Bar, located in a pristine position right on the Grand Canal, developed as a highly exclusive watering hole regularly frequented by the world's rich and famous. And it was especially well known for its signature cocktail, the Bellini, a blend of peach puree and Prosecco that was invented by Giuseppe Cipriani in the bar in the 1930s. Still open to this day, Harry's has been visited by countless famous names through the years, including everyone from Alfred Hitchcock to Ernest Hemingway, Richard Burton, Truman Capote, Orson Welles, and one Peggy Guggenheim, an American art collector who lends her name to the famed modern art collection housed behind this unique gateway. Born in New York City at the end of the 19th century, Peggy Guggenheim was a prolific art collector in Europe around the time of the Second World War. And in 1949, she decided to settle down here in Venice, where she'd been invited to exhibit her collection at the old Palazzo Venier dei Leoni, an unfinished 18th century palace overlooking the Grand Canal. And that palace is located just behind the walls to our right, with Peggy Guggenheim's art collection still open to the public to this day, and standing as one of the most popular attractions in Venice, said to be second only to the Doge's Palace in annual visitor numbers. Unlike the more classically focused Gallerie dell'Accademia that we passed by earlier, the Peggy Guggenheim collection is home to a collection of much more modern artworks, including paintings by Pablo Picasso, René Magritte, and many more. Of course, as we've explained over the course of this walk, Venice is one of the world's greatest cultural hubs, having produced a wealth of Europe's finest minds through the centuries, while in recent decades it's reaffirmed its position as a crossing point for many different cultures from around the world, its galleries now housing works painted by international artists, collected by those originally from overseas. That cultural melting point is reminiscent, then, of how Venice originally rose to become one of the world's wealthiest and most important cities, sitting at a crossroads between West and East in the medieval era, that allowed its commercial market sphere to blossom, and its sea trade to become arguably the most powerful in the region for centuries. And as we've strolled the city's streets, crossed its canals, and admired its countless landmarks over the last 2.5 hours, we've only just scratched the surface of Venice's truly illustrious history. Having started out as a swampy lagoon home to a loose collection of tiny islands, this most serene city grew into one of the medieval world's most impressively stable and powerful states, surviving for more than 1,100 years before its eventual fall at the hands of Napoleon in the late 18th century. Now part of the modern nation of Italy, Venice certainly provides everything quintessentially Italian that visitors will want to experience. But there's of course something entirely unique about this city in particular. And while we're now beginning to wrap up our epic walk through Venice's history, there's still much more for us to see as we make our way into the very bottom corner of the historic city centre. Nestled away here, for example, we find the historic Church of San Gregorio. Built in the mid-15th century, this church once belonged to a neighbouring abbey, and it was originally founded more than 1100 years ago in the 9th century. But it was eventually closed down in the early 19th century, and today it's entirely unused. You won't find many cities around the world where historic 15th century churches are left unused. But as we discussed in the second part of our walk, churches like San Gregorio certainly aren't in short supply in Venice. Yet, with the city's rapidly declining population, it's difficult to find a congregation to support them as places of worship, or even to find a new use entirely for them. Of course, that's not the case for all of Venice's historic churches, as here we've finally reached the spectacular Basilica di Santa Maria della Salute, the city's imposing white-domed church that dominates the southern end of the Grand Canal. The basilica is easily visible from St. Mark's Square and the Riva degli Schiavoni, where we started our walk. But from this point it actually doesn't appear that much bigger than the disused Church of San Gregorio just across the water from it. But having strolled through the streets of Dorsoduro, we've now returned to the banks of the Grand Canal, just a few feet away from where it reaches its end. This small island, home to the basilica, is known as the Punta della Dogana, which literally means customs point. Sticking out into the San Marco basin of the Venetian lagoon, it was on this island that a large customs house was built to check goods coming into the Republic. Of course, during the Republic's heyday, it became ever more important to keep an eye on the comings and goings in sea trade. And so around the time of the 14th century, this strategically located island became home to a collection of rudimentary docks and customs facilities for this very purpose. As sea trade continued to grow, a dedicated customs house was built here in 1677, that being the building that we can see just in front of us, and straight across the Grand Canal from the major centre of the Republic's government, St. Mark's Square. The customs house was built during a period of feverish development on this tiny triangular island, around the same time as this grand church, the Basilica di Santa Maria della Salute. Completed in 1687, this basilica took 56 years to build, and its name, which literally translates as the Basilica of St. Mary of Health, points towards the reason that it was built. Venice, as one of Europe's most densely populated cities, was devastated by a wave of the plague in the early 1630s. More than 80,000 Venetians died during the epidemic, while more than 600,000 people in the wider territories of the Republic were killed. And so, in an effort to prevent a similar disaster in future, the city decided to build a huge new church as an offering to the Virgin Mary, commonly regarded as a protector of Venice through history. That immense church, designed with a striking dome and white facade, today still houses many relics and paintings which bear reference to that awful moment in Venetian history. But in the modern day, the building's beauty makes it one of the most beloved and most photographed landmarks in the city, particularly when viewed from on top of the Academy Bridge, as we saw earlier on, or from the opposite side of the Grand Canal by St. Mark's Square and the Riva degli Schiavoni. If you remember back to the very beginning of the first part of our walk, it was from the Riva degli Schiavoni that we could see the basilica behind a row of gondolas lit by the beautiful morning sun. And although it's clouded over somewhat as we've made our way around the city, we can now look back across to the point where we started more than 2.5 hours ago, with St. Mark's Campanile standing tall above the buildings of San Marco. We obviously can't walk back across the Grand Canal to make our tour a full circle, but interestingly there has historically been a bridge linking St. Mark's Square with the Basilica on this side of the canal. As part of the city's offering to the Virgin Mary to prevent future epidemics, it was decided that the Senate of the Venetian Republic would make an annual pilgrimage to the Basilica here on the 21st of November each year, that being the day of the Festa della Madonna della Salute, or the Feast of the Presentation of the Virgin Mary. A temporary bridge is still constructed every year for the event to this day, providing not just a physical link between two sides of the Grand Canal, but a visible link to Venice's lengthy history and its rich traditions. Everybody knows Venice for its canals and its gondolas, but as we've seen over the course of this epic walk, there's so much more to this enchanting, fascinating city than just that. Having started out at the crack of dawn, we've navigated our way through the narrow streets of this historic city, and passed by a vast array of incredible landmarks, from the majestic Rialto Bridge to the sprawling St. Mark's Square, the beautiful Zattere, the many campi and churches of San Polo, the unusual Palazzo Contarini del Bovolo, the stunningly preserved Hunchback of Rialto, and tens upon tens of fascinating bridges, ranging from the beautiful Tron Bridge in San Marco to Dorsoduro's Bridge of Fists. However, after all of that, it's here on the Punta della Dogana that we've finally come to the end of our walk around Venice. If you're still with us after more than 2.5 hours, then I'd like to say grazie davvero. Thank you so much for watching. This has been a very long tour, but it's a walk that you can take yourself on a day out when in Venice. And so I hope that this video has given you a greater insight, not just into the stories of the buildings, canals and streets that you'll see while in Venice, but the city, its people, and its centuries of fascinating history. I'll leave you with a view of yet more of Venice's iconic gondolas moored on the Grand Canal as the waves calmly lap against the shore, with St Mark's Campanile and the Riva degli Schiavoni, where we started out, in the background.